Welcome back, everyone. It's 5:02. I guess we'll kick this off. Um, I'm Pat, along with Brett from the Whiskey Outline and Binnies. Our friends Monique and Mike have joined us. Lisa Laird Dunn was supposed to be joining us this week, but unfortunately she was sick over the weekend. It sounds like she's starting to feel better now. So Tom Alberico has joined us. Tom is Director of Sales and Marketing, VP of Sales and Marketing at Laird & Company, has been with the family a very long time. So Tom's going to kind of cover everything New Jersey apple brandy for us nowadays. So with hopefully Dan Farber here jumps in soon. So Tom, you want to give us a quick background on some of the longer history of the Laird & Company?
Sure. Laird & Company is family run by the Laird family now since commercial records started in 1780. But in reality, the Laird family was in New Jersey distilling spirits before that, perhaps even close to 100 years before that. So the thought is that there's not that much written history, but the thought is that the family came from Scotland and they were familiar with distilling. But here in New Jersey, they found apples. So they were distilling apples. They were plentiful in that time, and they never stopped. So 1780 right through till today, the Laird family, now in 8th and 9th and 10th generation ownership, has been producing apple brandy in the same place with the same methods and formulas for 200 and almost 40 years.
Wow.
So, we've gone through all aspects of family history and all aspects of American history. But what makes us, I think, completely unique in the industry, not only is it that the same family has endured through all that time and has been able to sustain that business, but we're actually intertwined with American history, and we're certainly intertwined with beverage alcohol consumption, whether that be, revolutionary times when they would drink a pint of brandy to start the day at Harvard, or where brandy was basically apple brandy in particular was ubiquitous across the colonies, to the advent of bartending and cocktails, and through 2 world wars and prohibition, and intertwined also with history of presidents of the United States. The history and tradition of the family and the brand is truly remarkable. And I feel very honored to be able to be with the group and work with them over the great majority of my career.
Tom, how is that history archived? Like, is it a lot of like oral history? Because I'm sure there's some great stories there. And then how much of this is written down? How much of this is photographed?
Lisa maintains an archive. She's really been key to pulling the family history together, at least during my tenure. And we actually hired an archivist maybe 10 or 15 years ago to go through all the materials that we had. But luckily, the family has maintained files of advertisements, of accomplishments, of photographs, of different milestones from the family. And we do a pretty decent job at keeping it together. I shouldn't say we, Lisa in particular. She has done a fantastic job of keeping the history of the family together and current. But photographs, for example, we have the original ledger from 17, whatever it is. It's in the safe. I've seen it. There's photographs of it, where they can go back and trace the actual first record of the commercial sale of cider spirits. So it's based on that. I think it was even Christmas. I think it was Christmas Eve was the first record of a sale of cider spirits in 1780, which is, although they were producing it before that, that's the first confirmed historical record of it. And that piece of, that ledger is in the safe in the office where I work.
Does that mean they had to start paying taxes then?
Yeah, well, I think taxes came a little bit farther down the road, but yeah, we have lots of photographs of the tax man and the tax man had an office in our plant for years and years.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just happy to hear that it wasn't one of those horrific stories of like, then there was a fire and a flood and all these things got destroyed. Like, it sounds like you've got a really amazing intact. Is there a museum if you come there?
No, there isn't, but Lisa is planning the renovation of the actual barn on the property. And within a couple of years, we hope that we will have a historical museum and then also a place for people to gather, that we could get together and do seminars and have functions and so forth. But that's been put on hold, but the project was started.
There's a great historian here with us that could probably give you a lot of context through all of that.
No doubt.
Yes, the records are nice and everything, but my opinion has always been if the public can't look at them, then they're not really worth anything. If a researcher can't come in and do it, and see them, I always encourage people, even in the whiskey industry, if they've got real old records like that, to donate them to a local historical society that's got, the acid-free material to keep the records safe, to keep a fireproof place to keep them, that type of thing. Plus, makes it available so, like, if you got a graduate student that wants to do a master's thesis on brandy distilling, he can come and see them and use them. So
how just curiosity, so how much, because you're talking about possibly having a facility in the old barn, how often has Laird's moved physical locations in the last 240 to 340 years?
Just once. So the company and the family lived and did the distilling at the intersection of 537 Route 34, which was the location of what's now the Colts Neck Inn. So at that intersection, which was a carriage stop for people who were on their way up to New York or down from New York to the Philadelphia, Baltimore area, that's where the family settled. So that's where we did all of our distilling and was always in connection with and associated with that inn. So the inn was basically the area where they would sell their products. And they also had other things they would do, it was like a general store too. So they sold shoes, they sold wood, they sold all sorts of things at that inn and around that inn. But in 1850 timeframe, that distillery did, Monique, burn down. So that burnt. Now, what was lost in that fire, I have no idea. But that's when the family moved from that Colts Neck location to approximately a mile or 2 miles up the road to what's Scobeyville. So in the 1850s, you moved to Scobeyville and have been there ever since. So within 2 miles of the two locations, it's hardly really even a different location. They're so close. But that original location at the Colts Neck Inn, that distillery burnt down.
What's on that spot now?
It's still an inn. It's still an inn. It's still the Colts Neck Inn, and the house where the Lairds actually lived behind the inn. Lisa actually wanted to purchase that house. It was up for sale for a couple of years ago, but that didn't happen. But yeah, the Colts Neck Inn is still there.
I want to know what a SCOBY is, because if there's a Scobeyville,
I think there's Captain, the name of the town. We're the only people in Scobeyville. I think there's maybe three houses in Scobeyville. You're lucky to find it on a map. But I understand there was a guy named Captain Scobey, and he, I guess he shipwrecked there near on the beach on the Jersey Shore somewhere, and that's where he's settled. And I'm quite sure that's the origin of the word Scobey, Scobeyville.
So going way back to like the initial distillations there, would it have been Scottish equipment or like a replica of Scottish equipment, but used to distill what was on property, apples?
Well, let's see, it's all conjecture, but the thought is that being Scottish and eventually doing this distilling, that they had some knowledge of distilling. So they had knowledge of what it takes to take a product and distill it into a potable spirit. But there's really no way of knowing exactly what was there, because there's no history to my knowledge that goes back that far. There's family history, so we have a family tree, who was born, how many children they had, where they died, when they were married. We have a beautiful, basically a big tapestry, you might call it, as the family tree. So you can trace right back from Lisa's son back to the original Laird who came over from Scotland. But beyond that family, those family municipal records, there's not much to look at.
So do you know, or maybe we want to talk about what exactly were they distilling and how has that evolved? Because we kind of touched on that with Mike, at least what the records say. We touched on that with Mike last week when we opened this up. So what were they distilling then, and sort of what's the timeline about how that's moved along?
To my knowledge, Brett and Mike, I could be wrong, but I am not aware of any other fruit or any other grain or any other product that they ever distilled. They uniquely distilled apples and apple juice and apple brandy, which is what we do today. We don't distill anything except apples. To my consternation, being on the sales side, it's like, can we make some bourbon, or can we make something else, for God's sake? How about a little bit of rye or something? No, just apples. So it's always been apples. And I would be very surprised, because I think I would have heard about it if they ever distilled anything else. So it's in the blood somehow. It's Laird. If you're Laird, you drink apple brandy. That's it. That's all there is.
And so how would that have evolved too? Because just like with in terms of aging, so what would have been, in other words, what that first sale, what exactly was sold in that first sale that you guys have a record of?
It was just a volume, right? So the product, the earliest vessel, I guess you could say, that we have where anything was bottled was back in, I guess, mid 1800s, something like that. Or before that, there's no bottling. There's just high proof spirits coming off of the spirit, goes into a barrel, and maybe it's aged, maybe it isn't long. I'm not sure. I mean, the name Jersey Lightning has survived as a pseudonym, as a nickname for our product. And we actually reintroduced an unaged apple brandy only for the first time, maybe, I don't know, about 5 or 6 years ago. So there's no doubt in my mind that they were selling an eau de vie, selling an unaged brandy. But then the cider spirits at the time were barrel aged. How long? What type of barrel? I certainly don't know. But
right. Well, was that aging? Because I think a lot of aging developed. Was that aging purposely to age, or was it just aging that happened because it was storage?
Yeah,
it was a storage medium.
I doubt that there would have been. Who knows? But I doubt that there would have been purposeful aging, because what are you going to do? When the barrel is filled, you got to empty the barrel to get the new vintage, you know. So unless it's put in some other sort of a demijohn or some other vessel, what are you going to do with it? The idea would be to empty the barrel and then refill it with the new season. But of course, you have more than one barrel. So the thought is that there were several barrels, and as the oldest was depleted, was filled with new brandy.
Mike, is that pretty consistent with what you hear up in that part of the world with?
That's what I would have said. You know, in Kentucky's apple brandy business back in the 1800s, that's pretty much the way it worked. They would take it barrels and sell it, you know, by the barrel. Well, because that's like in whiskey, until they invented machine blown glass bottles, the bottles were very expensive. You know, it would cost you, you know, $1 for a bottle, where you could buy a quart of whiskey to fill that bottle for 15 cents. You know,
So the glass was the premium.
yeah, the glass was the premium. So they sold it by the barrel, and you'd bring your own jug or bottle in and get your whiskey filled right from the bottle. That's the same thing that they were doing with brandy. They would have the brandy, and people would come in with their jugs or whatever, and get it filled right out at the saloon or the liquor store or wherever they were, you know, getting their whiskey or brandy.
This is probably a dumb question, but I have to imagine that some of this would have been pretty punchy, unaged, like lightning level stuff. Did people water it down? I've been reading a lot about toddies. People would have their own home like toddy mix, and that, you know, a non-alcoholic mixer. Was there a mind towards cocktails, or how did you actually consume it?
The information on proofing and alcoholic content is I don't know of any that's going to be able for you to determine, well, what was the proof of that product. You know, when it comes off the still, it's coming off the still at like 140 proof, something like that, 130 or somewhere, you know, in that range. Then I mean, it's awful hard to drink that, you know, so
Maybe not in 1680 though, on Christmas Eve.
so if there, and then there's the people who are actually commercializing it, right? So Michael's saying somebody would come in and buy a barrel. You're going to buy a barrel, then you have your own inn, and you have a hotel, or you have someplace, or you're running a college or somewhere where you need to distribute that alcohol. I think it's very likely that it was either diluted by the distiller or diluted by the person that purchased it so you could drink it.
Most distillers diluted it down, at least in the whiskey industry, and I imagine the same is true for the brandy industry. They diluted their whiskey down for barrel proof somewhere between 90 and 105 proof, because that's what people thought was drinkable proof.
Right.
And I don't see why they wouldn't do the same for brandy.
Right. I mean, that's our historic, that's the one that we say our historic product, the one that our ancestors made and that George Washington drank, was our 100 proof brandy. I mean, that is the product that we feel was the backbone and the ancestor of any expression that we make today, is that 100 proof straight brandy.
Well, and not to speak at all for Laird's, but I have to assume too, at the point at which you're selling for volume alone in a stone crock that you bring from home, if anything, you'd want to proof it down more because you're selling by volume, and no one had a way to double check if it was 100 proof or 102 or 96.
True.
Well, you got to remember you had the tax man still, at least, you know, early on, 1790s up to 1802. You had that first whiskey tax, and then there was another one from 1814 to 1817. And that tax was based upon 100 proof whiskey. So most distillers, at least in Kentucky, you know, shot for that 100 proof mark, because it made the bookkeeping easier. You know, you had this many gallons of 100 proof whiskey. That's the amount of whiskey you were taxed on. And I imagine that was probably, you know, true everywhere else for brandy and elsewhere, you know, other spirits.
Of course, today that's true. We pay, you know, every 2 weeks based on proof gallons at 100 proof, right? So that 100 proof gallon is basically that metric that was always used. But I mean, the brandy was primarily sold by the mug, right? I mean, it's not that many people were going to buy a barrel. You would go to the inn or whatever, and you'd have your meal, and you drink it by the mug, right? So you could. It's not necessarily.
You might be surprised on that, because I've actually seen references like President Madison, bought a whole barrel of aged peach brandy. And there were people that would buy a whole barrel of brandy, particularly if they had like a wedding coming up or something.
Yeah. Well, people buy whole barrels now, but it's certainly the exception to the rule.
I say we have.
Yeah, we sell barrels to Binnies, because it's really fun to have the whole barrel. But most of our products, are sold a shot at a time.
Yeah.
Well, that would so the Lairds were just primarily producers, and their primary outlet for it, meaning that they really didn't have to sell it too much. Their primary outlet for it would be an inn in New Jersey. At what point in time in the family history did they decide to really start commercializing it, to sort of continue to produce and really be more commercial, wider than just the local community?
Well, before I get to that, I don't know whether you're familiar with this story or not, but we're talking about the same time period. The Laird family during that time of the middle 1800s was most famous not for brandy, not for distilling, but for horse racing. I don't know if you're aware of that. The Laird family at that location in Colts Neck, at the Colts Neck Inn, was not only were they doing this, a very, very versatile group of people. They were doing the distilling, running the inn, and so forth. But they were the family itself trained racehorses that rode prize racehorses. And in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, if you had a prized racehorse and you wanted a good trainer, you would probably consider the Laird family, because they were raising horses there. The name of the town is Colts Neck, and it's still today basically like the equivalent of Lexington, Kentucky is Colts Neck, New Jersey. If you ride around our area there, you'll see all sorts of thoroughbred horse breeding facilities. Needless to say, I mean, this is all needless to say, horse racing, cocktails, drinking. The cocktail horse was a breed. Cocktail horse was a breed that was distinguished from the American horse because it was imported from Europe, and the distinction generally was that those horses, a lot of them would have their tails were cut. If you see those old photographs of these racehorses, you'd see the tail was cut. It wasn't just natural. And of course, this is the time that the cocktail was prevalent. This is the time we're making brandy, and this is the time when cocktails started to come. Now, so the Laird family was given a horse called Fashion. Mike, you might have heard of this. I'm saying it. The horse was called Fashion. It was a mare, and it was trained by Samuel Laird. And that horse, Fashion, was a fantastic horse that had won several matches. And she was considered to be the fastest horse in the North. Mind you, this is leading up to Civil War. So she's the fastest horse in the North. There's no baseball, there's no football, there's no soccer, there's nothing. There's horse racing and boxing. That's all there was, and hunting, right? So horse racing is a big deal. This horse, Fashion, was pit against the fastest horse of the South, which was called Boston at the time. And they had a match race that was run in what is now Jamaica, Queens, I think. And at that race, it was such a big deal. I mean, bigger than the Super Bowl, senators, congressmen. It cost $20 in 1842 to get a seat in the grandstand for that race. Big deal. So plus Fashion, being a much smaller horse and a mare up against this beautiful black stallion, which was Boston, was the underdog. Needless to say, Fashion beat Boston in that match race in record time. So Fashion became a huge, huge phenomenon, a popular horse in all sorts of publications, and that made the Laird family and that the Samuel Laird, but who, by the way, his nephew rode the horse, was another Laird in that race, and they were very, very famous because they were in the horse business, much less than the distilling business. But our thought is, this is actually, I have a little bit to do with this, because I'm thinking to myself, I'm Samuel Laird. I'm training this horse. I'm going to the track. It's up the road here. Everybody likes cocktails. I'm bringing my brandy, right? We're going to have our brandy at this race, and that's going to be featured. We went so far as to try. There's a horse racing archive at Monmouth Track near us, and we went there because my thought was that Fashion actually had foaled some 10 offspring, and one of them was called New Fashion. She became Old Fashion. So our thought was maybe it's quite possible that the Old Fashion was related to that horse and related to our distillery and our brandy. I don't think we can prove it, but I think it has some merit in terms of its validity. But anyway, I digress. So that's really interesting. The family was
I love that.
Family was
Well, and it
not,
also explains Wisconsin.
Right? The brandy old fashioned. Now we know.
so again, like it's like in order to prove it, you'd have to have somebody in the stands at that race who was quoted in the newspaper as having that old-fashioned cocktail. You know? But anyway, it makes sense to me. So anyway, after that, the family did migrate away from it. It was nothing to do with horse industry today. The family has no association with horse racing, and of course migrated away from that fame and went into the commercial distillation distillery, and passed from father to son, but super under the radar. I mean, we were always under the radar. We're under the radar today. I mean, we never really went onto the radar screen.
Mhm.
So it's and then of course before and after Prohibition were the heyday for our company, specifically after Prohibition. After Prohibition, I think, was the absolute apex for the brandies, for the apple brandy, for the Laird family. They had a head start after Prohibition. I'm not exactly sure how, but they did get the ability to make thousands of gallons of brandy
I
during.
can tell you if you want to know.
What's that?
I can tell you if you want to know.
Please.
In 1928, medicinal spirits were running short. So the government gave certain distilleries the ability to renew their stocks and gave a certain amount of whiskey that they could make. Well, the same thing fell through for brandy as well. So I'm sure Laird's had a certain percentage of apple brandy that they could make to replenish whiskey or medicinal stocks, because apple brandy was a thing that was possible to buy as medicinal spirits during Prohibition.
Mhm.
So when Prohibition was lifted, we had brandy to sell, and
Right.
that's when we really had our heyday for apple brandy and apple spirits.
We've just been joined by another apple brandy distiller in Dan
Hello.
Farber. Hi, Dan.
Hi.
Hello.
Tom, I don't know if you've met Dan before. Dan distills out in Northern California. I know he knows Lisa well.
No, I haven't, Dan, but greetings to you.
Greetings to you. You know,
So-
I have been listening for a second. What was the mark? I mean, you said like the heyday was post-prohibition. And where was Laird selling it? Like, where were the big markets, for Laird's and those?
Was certainly well outside of New Jersey. So at that time we were, distributing just like a national distributor would. As a matter of fact, because everybody had apples, everybody distilled apples before Prohibition. Everybody made cider, everybody made hard cider. A lot of people did the jacking process. Some people distilled. There were several distilleries, but Laird was for sure the preeminent brand at the time. So after Prohibition, people would fill their brand, the innkeepers would fill their bottles of inexpensive or not unknown brandy into the Laird bottle. So you'd buy your Laird bottle, you'd sell it, then you'd fill it with an inexpensive unknown brand and then sell it. So the Laird family actually patented a non-refillable cap at that time, post-Prohibition. So I thought that was also very interesting. And then the Laird family did go on a campaign to purchase some of these other distilleries. And come the 60s or so, there weren't any apple distillers left. It was just us.
Do you want to explain the jacking process and how how that production is different than what we get today with the brandy?
Sure. So if you're with your apple orchard at home and you make you press your apples and come up with your juice, ferment your juice, of course you can use that cider and drink it. But if you were to leave the cider after it's fermented in the cold, so during the winter, no refrigeration, so you leave that barrel out in the barn where it can freeze. When it freezes, the only thing that freezes is the water. So if you're able to drain the barrel during winter when the water has frozen, and you reduce the volume of that cider by 50% or more, perhaps a lot more, you're going to take the alcohol by volume in the cider from 6% to maybe as high as 20.
Mm-hmm.
So now you've jacked the alcohol in that cider without distillation. So it's just a home method of bringing that alcohol content up without going through the distillation process.
So
Yes.
it's really actually completely analogous. Jacking is what's known as fractional crystallization, and distillation is fractional vapor. Distillation is really fractional vapor removal. So in the same way that the vapor in equilibrium with a liquid at higher temperature is more alcohol rich, and so we pull that piece off, the solid that crystallizes from a liquid, in this case pure water ice, is pure water. So you're enriching the liquid now in alcohol, and importantly everything else. And so when the temperature, so this would be a process that would occur during the season. So initially the freezing point of that water crystal, it's just like, remember, if you try to freeze water, pure water, it freezes at 0 degrees centigrade. If you add salt to the water, you will still crystallize pure water crystals, but the crystallization temperature now is much lower, right? For a saturated water salt solution, it's 0 degrees Fahrenheit. And the same thing happens with alcoholic solutions. So you lower the temperature a little bit, you freeze a little bit of that water crystal, you can remove it, enriching the liquid and all those things. But now you need the temperature to go down colder to get the next layer of crystals off. And if the temperature drops significantly colder, you can kind of keep doing that process. So the level of enrichment that you can get in the liquid then becomes dependent on how cold that winter might get, how far you could get with the jacking process. But importantly, you're concentrating everything into the liquid. You're only removing pure water. Whereas when you're distilling, we're able to separate out all the heads and tails fractions Applejack in that context, jacked apple cider is concentrating all of those things. So it's a different flavor, it's a different beast, and you certainly feel differently after drinking it.
Yeah, and plus,
Dangerous with not being able to remove methanol from the heads?
Not at all. You can't remove, all you're removing in the jacking process really is almost pure water, because when water ice crystallizes, there's a very, very small amount of solubility of these other things in a water ice crystal, but not measurable. You can imagine that the crystals that are coming off are pure water ice.
and if there were any sugar in that cider, then the sugar would remain in that solution too.
Everything.
Right. It was a completely different product, obviously, than apple brandy.
So if you guys still have Applejack, is that still done with the classic jacking process?
No. I mean, we never did freeze distillation. It was always heat distillation, and the thought is that there was so much jacking that the name, the brandy and the Applejack became synonymous. No real proof of that, though.
Not in this group. Not in this group, Tom. So how high could you get the alcohol content up? Could you even get it up to the proof of a distillate?
I don't know. I'll defer to Dan. How much, if you've got, I don't know how much water you can remove. I mean, it's just a math equation. If you remove 80% of the volume, then you're going to have, I don't know. I don't know how high you can go. I don't think you can go as high as a 40% alcohol.
There's beer producers. There's German Eisbach producers that have gotten
And Brewdog.
beers. And
yeah.
Brewdog in Scotland have gotten beers through ice distillation up to 50, 60% alcohol.
Oh, wow. Okay.
But it's like, they're insanely expensive. So much of the product has gone to waste at that point. And they're going freezer after freezer after freezer into like specialized ice cream freezers and stuff that get them colder and colder and colder and colder. And it takes a long time. And frankly, the beer tastes like crap. So, they're very, very famous and sought after, but they certainly don't taste good.
I would imagine it was probably a serendipitous, because the barrel froze. Nobody really wanted it to freeze. And then all of a sudden this beautiful sort of sweet, sort of higher proof liquid comes out and say, "Hey, damn, that's great. Let's do that again." We figured out how to do it. We used to sell a product that came from Canada that was made in that fashion. It was a jacked cider they called the Sortilege, and I think it was somewhere in the neighborhood of like 18% or something like that. I think if it were to get up above that, I don't know. Like you said, Dan, it may even become more difficult to drink. The more water you remove, the more displeasing I think it would be. I think at a 20%, it's probably quite good. Higher than that, I don't know.
So Tom, you said that at one point Laird's bought up other distilleries, and then by the 60s you said Laird's was the only one left. So those were bought up and then kind of brought together and then sold, or how did that work?
That's one of the reasons why we don't distill in New Jersey anymore. Because, well, two reasons. One, there aren't enough apples in New Jersey. We use all these millions of pounds of apples, but we bought distilleries, one in upstate New York, one in Virginia, and others. And then we converted those distilleries to make our product. And the one in Virginia was situated right there in the Shenandoah region, where the apple production today is still wonderful, great production of apples, where in our area it isn't. So we would have had to have trucked all the apples into our plant in New Jersey, but now we process the apples and distill them at that distillery in New Jersey, which is one of the ones we bought after Prohibition.
So what, because I think for a lot of people, the product, when did the balance for Laird's tip more heavily to Applejack as the volume product versus the brandies?
Oh, that
Or
was
is
in
that
the
the case
60s.
of-
That was in the 60s. So when in the late 50s and 60s, when all all of the aged spirits, whether they be Scotch, whiskey, were all at the 86 and 90 proof levels, gin included. Everything was at high proof.
Mhm.
But then the tendency at the time was to go lighter and to have a lighter spirit. So scotches were blended to be lower proof, whiskeys, gins, you name it. Everything was then diluted to a lower proof for ease of mixing, for cost reasons, and just for trend tendency. At that time, because apple brandy was its own category with the TTB, we could not do that. We were prohibited from blending our brandy with a neutral grain, for example, to make it lighter and to reduce proof and to make it more affordable. But the tendency was customer wanted a lighter spirit. So the Laird family petitioned TTB and was able to form a new category, which was blended apple brandy. So that was when that category was created by the Laird family so that we could compete with the lighter blends of whiskey. And that at that time, of course, there was a preference and there was a price savings, right? So it's a lot less expensive to make grain neutral spirit than it is to make apple brandy. And so that was the product that had the most legs at the time. And it's only till recently, only until say the last decade, that the trend actually went the other way. And it's going from the blended product towards, again, the straight product.
So we've got actually in a couple of these maybe to cover, and this is probably going to be a combination of Tom and Dan and me, Mike. Have you considered, one of them comes from Officer Jack, have you considered the classic jacking method and then just heating to cook off the problematic heads? Sounds convoluted, but could be an interesting way to produce a historical release. 2026 is the 250th birthday of the country and gives you a few years to make a batch if you wanted to do that. And then the other thing that which I think we know, is could you improve the final ABV by adding sugar to the ferment and making a higher alcohol cider that you then jack?
He is not going to give up until you make a jacked cider, I think.
Right.
Well, I could tell, just to start, fermentation through yeast cannot go higher than a certain percentage because the alcohol kills the yeast. So natural fermentation, you're going to be blocked at 15, 16, whatever percent. You're not going to get higher a natural fermentation from any food. So that's out. But yeah, we could certainly do something like that. But I'll tell you something else. The Lairds are a conservative group. They're not very big risk takers. They don't deviate very much. So for them to take, I would love to see like I said, with my hat, I would love to see these things. I could sell all this stuff, but it's unlikely that we would do something like that, to be honest with you. Although it would be very.
Because it sounds like you're talking about jacking something and then distilling still.
Yeah, that would be, I don't know, it's almost counterintuitive, right? If you're going to distill it. If you're going to jack it. But it would be interesting anyway.
Just the jacking process is not changing the chemistry at all. Maybe getting the cider very, very cold somehow changes the chemistry. Certainly lagering does for beer, but honestly, the apple jacks I've tasted taste like concentrated apple cider. So it doesn't seem like there's significant chemical transformation that takes place during the jacking process. And so certainly you would be bringing the alcohol level up high enough that for a single pass still, you're getting into the range where you can do one pass and make a fair bit of brandy, but I don't see a large advantage to that in any way whatsoever. And the second question, which is, would you or could you increase the alcohol content by adding sugar? That
it would have to ferment.
It would have to ferment, but you'd be back to the same problem. As soon as the alcohol content is up, the temperature at which the water will crystallize is the same whether that alcohol has been produced through, whether you've increased the alcohol content by fermentation from the beginning or by jacking as you go along. And secondly, just as a side comment, adding sugar to increase the alcohol content of the base of any spirit is a very good way to make a much cheaper spirit, but it never ever can increase the quality of the spirit. And think about it, I sort of say that sugar added ferments have unsupported alcohol. It's alcohol that is there, so you can certainly increase the volume of X brandy, rum that your whiskey that you would get from it, but you don't get any more flavor. You get zero flavor from the alcohol produced by the fermentation of sugar. And so what you end up doing is diluting the character and qualities of the final product. So when you look at like Laird's apple brandy, which is all of the sugars solely derived from apples, from ripe fruit, that's the kind of fermentation that's going to give you the most aromatic brandy. And and if the Lairds are conservative, and certainly they're wise, you would never want to dilute those characters by adding sugar to the fermentation. So
So really,
they have a beautiful product that comes naturally from directly from fruit. Adding sugars is always kind of a cheap band-aid.
I love that too. The super conservative family are the goofballs that have a 7.5-year-old vintage on the market.
You want to know why that happened? I asked the same question. I said, how in the world did we ever come up with 7.5 years of age? And this is one that the family could answer because it was done by Lisa's uncle. So, and he told me, and they told me that they just wanted to be different. So it was just a differentiation from in the marketplace, and it's still there. I don't know. Does anybody know of any other spirit that has a half year of aging?
Mr. Beach.
I'm not aware of any.
Well, there are some whiskeys that do it by month that comes out to a half year. They may have 100 months or whatever, and sometimes it comes out to a half year. And also there's a lot of bonded whiskey that'll be a half year, made in the spring and then bottled in the fall.
But they're not selling it as 8.5-year-old bourbon, right? So we've marketed it as 7.5-year-old apple brandy since inception. So that's unique too. We like it.
It's memorable.
And then you said that the mix, so you said your mix is starting to shift back from the Applejack to the actual brandies. When did that start? When did the tide start turning, and where do you stand with that now?
Before Brett, the other thing is that Applejack, this is another thing that we confuse. We try to do our best to confuse everyone. We've called our blended brandy Applejack for decades, but Applejack and apple brandy are synonymous. So Applejack can be blended and Applejack can be straight. So, and we have both. We have our Applejack blend, which is a blended brandy, and we have our straight Applejack 86, which is a straight. But it started, Brett, not really that long ago with the advent of modern bartending and mixology. When today's professional, dedicated, sincere bartenders and enthusiasts started to read and educate themselves and look at the history books and look at the old cocktail books, and lo and behold, they found our product, and they would say, wait a second, what is this? What's this apple brandy? I'm in Chicago or I'm in Manhattan. I can buy the blended product, but I don't have access to this brandy. How do I get that? So that's really was the genesis for the resurgence of our straight apple. At that time, I'm so thankful that it survived. At that time, we were selling so few bottles of 100 proof. I mean, maybe we sold 1,500 cases a year at the most. Maybe I'm saying bottles. We were at like 100, 200 cases. of Apple Brandy 100. And then it just started to snowball to the extent that we ran out of brandy. Well, we ran out of bonded brandy. For 3 years, we had to take bottled and bond off of the label because we didn't have enough of 4-year-old brandy to make the 100 proof. We had to mix it with 3, a little bit of 3, and we had maybe some 5, but we ran out of brandy. Now, we never stopped making the blend, obviously, because that was our mainstay. And we had to continue to make the blend, but we ran out of brandy. Since that time, the shift has become very slow. You'll still have difficulty, with the exception of the fine mini stores, of finding lots of examples of our, expressions of our product. And most stores, you'll find the blend. And in many stores, you might even not find that. But to find the blend and the straight Applejack and the straight brandy or 7.5 was unusual. It's only in the best stores that you could find the straight apple. But it's just a matter of a more educated customer and a bartender who insisted on that full flavored that Pat's hanging up, holding up there. See that bottle, Pat, is the 3-year time when we didn't make the bottle and bond. Are you aware of that?
I am.
So
We have 2 of them stashed away here.
So that's a collector's item because that was only during those couple years when we couldn't put bottled and bond on the label. And it says founded in 1780 instead of bottled and bond. It's been now, I think, 3 years or more since we were able to put bottled and bond back. But it was Brett, the resurgence of serious bartending when the paradigm shift. And now
having worked with the brand here in Chicago at that time and working with Earl on allocations, oh my God, it was just this constant. We had to allocate it for, Binny's would get some and then like 3 cocktail bars. If you put it on your cocktail menu, it was gone. It was spoken for. There was no reason to sell anybody 3 bottles of it. You either had it in a cocktail and you got a few cases, you were a top retailer, you got a few cases, and we were out of stock all the time. What's the oldest brandy still aging at Laird's?
We run out of the brandy. We don't have anything in a barrel that's older than 12 that I'm aware of, unless something's hidden somewhere. We have bottles, but we don't have anything older than 12 because we don't have enough 12. We only make last year before we made 66 packs, so, and that's got us hold us for the whole globe, and it's not enough for one state. So the 12, he's not going to hold on to that for much longer because there's such clamor for it and there's so few barrels. But we did set aside,
Farber, the power of the vintage.
That's right.
So we did set aside a little bit extra, but that extra brandy won't come into play for the 12-year-old product for 2 years.
Are you
Right.
doing
That's a reasonable amount of time for us to wait, though, honestly.
You got to have a lot of foresight.
So, a couple of questions about the production, I guess. It's, we've been to a lot of whiskey distilleries. I can't say I've ever been to an apple brandy specific distillery. What would we see different down at the distillery in Virginia than we might see at a distillery in Kentucky?
Well, we're a lot smaller, that's for sure.
But you've got some astonishingly gorgeous material handling equipment on the way into the distillery, which is unique, I think, in the United States.
We're talking like apple processing type stuff, Dan?
We're talking about beautiful flow chute. The way you move apples is stunning. If you've never been to an apple distillery, well, maybe I can set this up. Apples float, and that makes for an incredibly rich number of systems to get apples from, let's say, the truck to the distillery. But Laird's has a unique one, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, the apples are dumped into the bins from the trucks, but then they're metered into, is like, if you've ever been to a water park and there's a lazy river, you
Mhm.
can float around in the lazy river. So the apples just float downstream in a very lazy river into the plant, where they're then crushed and made into apple juice. But it's old school. It's really old school.
I was gonna
You
say
can,
it's like from aqueducts. That's what was really
Well,
changed.
yeah.
That's
but-
Roger Grolt, the Calvados producer, Roger Grolt. That's actually how they move their apples around as well. They just dump it. There's a big channel in the middle of their yard, and as it comes in from harvest, they dump it in the yard, and then they just sort of shove and move it until it falls in the trench and it turns around. But that's been hundreds of years probably that's existed in France. So
And then our distillery itself, the distillery uses a combination pot and column. So we've got a copper pot hybrid that is then into a column still. And don't quiz me too hard on the distillation aspect, because it's not my forte.
Oh, it's fine. So I mean, you're processing apples in. These apples are fermenting in stainless steel, or are they some kind of wooden ferment?
No, they're fermenting outside, actually. The tanks are outside. They're fiberglass, and they're jacketed so that they can be cooled. Temperature can be maintained, but it limits our ability to ferment apples. We don't ferment inside with stainless steel with temperature controlled fermenters. The fermenters being outside, the ability to control the temperature is limited. So we can only ferment in the fall or in the spring. So we can ferment in the spring if we have cold storage apples. We can only ferment during those periods of time, and then of course through the summer. But then through the summer also, the temperatures can maybe get too high. So not having the ability to, like a stainless steel fermenter, to have that direct control over the fermentation process limits us to basically spring and fall.
So then it goes through distillation, and then you got to barrel it for aging. What kind of barrels are you using? I mean, everybody knows bourbon barrels and all. You go anywhere on the bourbon trail, and they love to talk about what number char they're using or whether they're toasting them, and whose great grandpappy worked at what cooperage 200 years ago, and all that.
Well, we can cooper in any barrel, but the fact of the matter is that Laird & Company also does Kentucky fillings of bourbon. So we're filling bourbon, we're laying down bourbon in Kentucky, and we have more bourbon barrels of our own in Kentucky than we need to do our own brandy. So all of the bourbon barrels we use in Kentucky are then shipped to the plant in Virginia. So we're using our own bourbon barrels for our own bourbon, and then passing the apple through there. So all of our barrels are once used bourbon. Now the chars, I imagine we could get different chars in there, but if they're different, we're not even aware of the differences. By the way, we're going to do, I hope it goes to fruition. I think I've got everybody convinced. The bourbon comes out of the barrel, the brandy goes in the bourbon barrel, and then when the brandy comes out of the bourbon barrel, there's a huge clamor for that. Breweries, you name it, wineries, they all want our bourbon, our brandy barrels. What we're going to do is put the bourbon back in the apple barrel. So
yeah, of course.
I got a better idea for you. Make corn whiskey. Corn whiskey has to be used barrels anyway. Make some corn whiskey, put it in those used brandy barrels, and age it for 4 years.
I bet that would be delicious, actually.
Michael, we are experimenting with that. We've got
Nice.
corn whiskey, which is so mellow and smooth. Got corn whiskey, and that's in apple brandy barrels. And we've got the bourbon, which was born in the barrel was orphaned and now returns back in its old age. So those are interesting things that we are doing.
That corn whiskey can be called Veach Edition.
Yeah.
So have you ever, I mean, like you said, they're a conservative family, but going back to Scottish roots, I mean, have they looked at doing some traditional Scottish kind of methods of maturation, like anything in terms of like Oloroso sherry or Madeira port? Peating apples? Can you peat apples?
Suppose you could, no, but not to my knowledge. We've cooperated with some Scotch producers and sold some Scotch over the years, and we're thinking about sending some of our barrels over to the other side of the pond to experiment with that. But not that I'm aware of, Monique, any Scotch methods that we would use. It's so far removed, right? I mean, the last Scotsman was 2.5 centuries ago that had any knowledge of Scotland.
Danny, you look like you're out at the vineyard, which means you are near your own apples. How are the apples coming along?
They are coming along fine. They're just babies, and they're still in their wintertime sleep, luckily. So, but they're coming along. We were just looking at some new plantings we're probably going to set up to do this year. I mean, nothing gigantic, we'll add another 13 acres this year.
And it's all your own product, right, Dan?
Yeah. So right. So we're only producing now off of these orchards and vineyards here. But that's also why we're not producing apple brandy this year, because we don't have any apples.
Yeah.
Well, and most of your apple brandy's been, I mean, basically discontinued because it's all aged and you just don't have enough of it. I mean, kind of to Tom's point.
Yeah. Yeah. The demand, I mean, honestly, when I first started, we were going to be a 100% apple brandy distillery. And that's, I had become interested in apple brandies in France, and I really did not know of any. I knew of the tradition of apple brandy in the United States, but I didn't really know of any apple brandy producers in the United States. And the first time I came across a bottle of Laird's, I was stunned, that still there was a producer of apple brandy. This is late 1970s, early 1980s. So there was still a producer of apple brandy in the United States. Not only was there a producer, but a producer had been around for so long. I mean, so for me, Laird's has always sort of been a guide star, in the industry for the ability to produce apple spirits and have them be recognized as world-class spirits. So we're sort of, younger newbies to this thing, but it's always been, part of our core DNA. The region here where I am here, Cortalitas, California, is known for apple growing. Another very, very old American institution is founded just down the street, Martinelli's Cider. They don't do anything alcoholic, but they've produced cider for hundreds of years. So it's kind of it's another old region of apple production here. But and so the future will be really, really pretty. Right. I mean, do you see just demand for your apple brandy products growing and growing and growing now?
Well, yes. I mean, we've got now distribution, global distribution, literally just about everywhere in the world, and we've got distribution here in the States. The category, the brandy category is still, I don't know how I'd even characterize it, is still unrecognized, misunderstood, cloaked somehow. It's a unique problem that it's been my entire career as well. How you get that apple brandy, and it's the word brandy, I think that is part of the challenge, because consumer knows what to do whiskey. They know what to do with gin. They know what to do with rum and vodka. Brandy is a little different because it's consumed differently. The connotations are different. And then you have the whole world of commercial, industrial produced brandy, much of which is then flavored. Even some of it is flavored with apples or apple flavor. So the consumer is confused by the whole situation. You can't even define Dan's, if Dan sold his product into a store and they said, well, where am I going to where do you put it? You put it with E&J apple flavored brandy. Do you put it with cognac? Do you put it with Calvados? Do you put it with bourbon? Do you put it with whiskey? There's really, it's a difficult situation as to where you can put it, because so many people during my career would say, well, I bought your apple brandy and my God, it was horrible. And I said, horrible? What do you mean it was horrible? Well, it didn't taste like apples and it wasn't sweet, so I don't know, it's horrible. And there's that, I don't think anybody would buy a bottle of bourbon and say, why doesn't this taste like bread, or cognac and say, why doesn't this taste like grapes? So, but it's a situation that goes even beyond that, because then what is the use? Even ourselves, we sell it as you drink it neat, like you would cognac. You drink it mixed. Most of our products is consumed mixed in spirits and cocktails, but it's betwixt and between, and we've never been able to break out. Now, Dan, in the last you read all these articles, well, brandy, brandy's this and brandy's that, and I think the future is going to be with people like Dan, with us persevering. And Dan is going to say, he's going to take those different varieties that he has out there in his field, and he's going to take his particular method of distillation, and he's going to experiment with whatever it is that he does. And he's going to make some beautiful brandies there. And it's going to be some time where we got to get people like the folks at Binny's and the people that shop at Binny's to say, hey, this is a unexplored territory. This is an area that is so fertile, so interesting, so rewarding. And all we need to do is kind of delve into it a little bit, and you're going to get great rewards. But it takes a little bit of courage, and it takes a little bit of coaxing. So I've yet to see that. We're seeing this, the Apple sales were basically on a steady decline, all during which time whiskey basically was on a steady decline. Now we're seeing a gradual increase. It's certainly not a U curve, but it's nice to see that there's gradual, slow, increasing interest in the category. And I think people like Dan and all the other folks that are out there producing apple are complementary to the category, and eventually will make it a more understandable category than it is today.
Well, and do know, Tom, that's part of the reason why we started this series.
We're doing this.
The other reasons we're doing the series is purely to try to get that information out for consumers that, there's a lot to brandy. The history of brandy in the United States, first and foremost, is very deep and rich, but the history, the present state of brandy is complex and growing. And so, we're not going to put Laird's or Osacalis there. That's not going by De Kuyper, apple brandy and peach brandy and Dubuchet on the shelf, right? I mean, it's a much, much closer, even by E&J, it's a much better fit to have things like that as close as we can get it to Calvados, because that is a style of apple brandy. If folks are going to know, that might be a style. It's like, okay, I know Calvados is apple brandy, but we would rather have people think about you in that manner rather than have what you said, people disappointed by how bad the product was because it doesn't taste like the Kuyper sour apple pucker.
I don't know how people could be disappointed in this 7.5-year-old. I've been enjoying it here. It's juicy and it's plush and it's just awesome. I mean, it helps that it's only 80 proof, I suppose, so it's just very sippable and rich. But I don't know. I think that's crazy.
Pat, thank you for that. One of the things that I encourage people to do is to, if you have an opportunity, is to taste the unaged brandy. Taste our unaged brandy and see how delightful it is and how fruity and smooth and rich and
Which
full.
we do sell as, it is on the shelf as Laird's Jersey Lightning.
There
That's
you
how
go.
we have it listed. Yeah.
When you taste that, and then you taste that in comparison to a grain spirit, like a bourbon or a whiskey, and you see the difference in the raw material, what it started from. Then it goes into the barrel and stuff. So you can recognize that smooth, sort of mellow fruit component right through, right into that bottle that Pat's drinking over there. Now, you know, it's I would never drink just raw white spirits for whiskey. It's just doesn't taste good. I would drink Jersey Lightning because it's made from that ripe fruit. And that's been sort of our distinction, because I think in our industry, Pat, Mike, Brett, Monique, again, even Dan, people love the taste of an aged spirit, right? Because it's delicious, whether it's cognac, rum, whiskey, bourbon. We want people to understand how our spirit, it joins that group, and also what makes it unique in that group. And you can really learn that by going right to the raw material and tasting it. And then you can recognize that flavor profile right through the whole aging.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. I think it goes really, it's true across the board with brandy in general, not, but if you could get consumers to be able to sort of stick their nose in a bin of apples before they enter, the facility, and then to be by the hammer mill or the shredder, and the apples are being shredded, and you just have this, the aroma. I mean, it's true too that in a whiskey distillery, that beautiful, malt bready character, that's a beautiful aroma too. But when the spirits come off the still, brandy has this sort of clarity, presence, and kind of young beauty that that whiskey never shows. Whiskey usually can show some structure and shoulders, big boldness, that we don't necessarily achieve in brandy. But brandy's a very, very elegant spirit right from its roots to its first start, and it's unfortunately it's underappreciated. I think some of it is because it's never as bold and in your face as grain spirits can be. They can have this intensity, and brandy tends to be broader and suppler, and and sometimes people are off put by the difference in structure rather than and sometimes correlate that in some ways to quality, where it is a quality of brandy that it's never as bold as great whiskeys, but it also is an endearing quality that it's so rich and wonderful. I mean, and Laird's is just a great example of how soft and inviting, fruit-based spirits can be, both in youth and in age.
Can I add something in here? I want to go back to what Dan was saying earlier. I want you to consider every whiskey brand, every Scotch brand, every cognac, brandy company out there, and then look at Laird. I guarantee you, they're going to be older than 95% of those companies out there. Mm-hmm. So they have a history as rich as any Scotch or any cognac. And that history or that longevity goes to show that people at one time really did appreciate that. And it's just re-educating them to learn to like that, like brandy for what it is, Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that is absolutely the hope. But you're right. And it's interesting to think I mean, if you go back to the 1600s for the existence, there are not a lot of European distilleries that are tracing back much earlier than that in terms of any kind of commercial level. And I would say none of them still exist in the same spot. I guess Kettle is pretty old. There's some vodka distilleries in Holland that are pretty old. What's the oldest Scotch producers? The oldest
Bowmore, I think.
Bowmore's 1700 something.
Yeah, and then it would have been Kilbeggan in Ireland, but it's still, I mean, you're talking single-digit distillers worldwide that we can maybe trust to be telling a somewhat, truthful story about how old their company actually is, versus this, single-family verifiable lineage here in a country where we're not used to stuff that old. Certainly not in the Midwest.
Yeah, you
Pretty
cool.
cool.
What, 1840? So you're looking, Laird's was around for 60 years before Johnny Walker.
Yeah.
And if you trace it back to their unofficial history, when they weren't a business, so to speak, and they were farmer distillers, you're talking 160 years before that.
Yeah, it really is a pretty staggering history when you stop and think about it like that.
I did my best to get adopted by the family, but I could never.
Tom, you have done just a fabulous job.
Yeah, thank you for filling in on short notice for us.
Yeah,
Tom.
this
was
is really
phenomenal.
awesome.
Well, I'm very happy, and I'm very happy that Lisa is recovered. It's a special family, and I'm very blessed to be with them.
It shows you appreciate it, man. Really. So thanks again for joining us.
We're gonna do what we can to make sure that the brandy tradition continues.
Yeah,
excellent.
It's always an honor for me to sit on a panel with you guys. That you're an iconic American institution.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you very much. Looking forward to your success too.
Tom, I feel like you got to go into Lisa's office, and there has got to be a bottle of Osacalis in there. Go in there and steal Dan's brandy from her and try it.
I apologize, Dan. I'm sure she knows everybody. I mean, compared to me, she knows everybody. So I'll definitely tell her that we spent some time together, and we'll.
No apologies. Sorry. One of these days we'll be able to spend time face to face, all of us again.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Indeed.
All right. So audience, we'll be back next week. Next Monday,
next week we have to be off because we're going to be doing some selections that are booked in at the time when we would normally do this. But the 15th, Pat, what do you say we talk to Dan and do a deep dive into Osacalis and the history of
this series continues
California.
Monday the 15th. You'll learn about how a mushroom-loving Francophile geologist started making French-inspired brandies in Northern California. Brett and I will be back next Wednesday and Friday next week. Next Wednesday, we're on with Starward Whiskey, a pretty awesome Australian single malt, ages in ex-red wine barrels. We had an awesome handpick last year. We got another one coming this year. Next Friday, Brett and I will be talking to Charlie and Andy Nelson from the Nelson's Greenbrier Distillery, another distillery with some kind of old history there that's kind of been revitalized now by a younger generation. So, Tom, thank you again for joining us. Dan, Mike, Monique, thank you.
Nice to see you guys.
Brandy panel, we'll see you on the 15th. Dan, get your history figured out by then, all right, man?
I will.
All right.
Thanks all.
See you
Good
guys.
night.
Have a good one. Thanks,
cheers,
Tom.
everyone.
guys.
Thanks for joining us for another virtual tasting. We'll see you next time.
Good night.
Bye.